We looked at the straight Ashigarami system in considerable detail. It's time now for us to switch our attention into the cross Ashigarami system. It's my belief that the cross Ashigarami system is probably the single most powerful and most controlling of all the leg lock options that we have in all of Jiu-Jitsu. Let's understand exactly what the position is and start to understand not only the position itself, but the very nature of the leg lock system as a whole, based on some of the considerations we'll soon be looking at. A cross Ashigarami refers to any situation where my training partner's leg goes across my center line, so my opponent's right leg will go over my right hip. Now there are a vast number of ways that I can lock my opponent's legs up with mine, many different forms of Ashigarami. It's important now for us to bring in one of the foundational principles of our leg lock system, and indeed Jiu-Jitsu itself. This is the notion of hierarchy. If there are a vast number of ways for me to lock up my opponent's legs, wouldn't it be useful if we had a way of ranking them from worst to best, from least desirable to most desirable? Well, let's have a look in that direction. There's a very simple guide as to what is the desirability of any given leg configuration in a leg entanglement. The two things that always determine our selection and whether or not where some given Ashigarami stands on the hierarchy of possibilities always comes down to two things. How vulnerable does the given Ashigarami make my legs to my opponent's counterattacks, and how much braking potential does that Ashigarami offer to me as the offensive player? I could, for example, lock my legs on the outside of my training partner's legs, and yes, there's actually considerable braking pressure which is possible in this position. However, I've exposed my feet to obvious counterattacks, and there's considerable braking pressure for my opponent too. Okay, so yes, I scored highly in terms of braking potential, but I scored poorly in terms of athlete safety to counterattacks. As a general rule, when we work in the cross Ashigarami position, the safest place for my feet as the offensive player is always to place my feet inside my opponent's legs. Of course, there are many other options outside of that, but the safest place for me as the attacking player is to have both of my feet inside both of my opponent's legs. Even within this given position, cross Ashigarami with my feet to the inside, there are many different varieties, options for me to work with. For example, here I've chosen a foot-to-foot position where one foot steps over the other and forms a connection of one foot to the other foot. This makes it difficult for my opponent to move and manipulate my feet. But of course there are many other options too. I could, for example, lock a semi or half senkaku or half triangle, where I lock my feet in just like so. I could go further and lock a full inside senkaku. I could take the inside senkaku, and as my opponent's hips rise, switch my feet across to the other side. And from here, we have many other ways that we can work. Okay, so you can see that even within our most preferred Ashigarami position, there's many varieties, all of which have their good and bad points. As a general rule, I like to see my students work with what we call closed wedges, where one leg reinforces another. And probably for most athletes, the strongest form of closed wedge will always be a senkaku. So if I'm going to place my feet to the inside position, the apex of the Ashigarami system will be both of my feet on the inside and my legs locked in the tightest possible closed wedge, a senkaku. So usually I encourage my athletes in situations like this to get their opponent's hips up, and then from here lock a tight senkaku like so. Now we have a very strongly closed wedge around our opponent's hips and knee. When he goes to move from a position like this, it's awfully difficult, regardless of which direction the senkaku is in. So for example, if my foot was inside, same thing. Here, it's very difficult for my opponent to go to move around and avoid the obvious pressure that I can put on my opponent. If he goes to step over, the strength of the Senkaku will hold him in position here, and now we can exert very, very strong braking forces upon the leg. Wherever he goes at this point, you have that strong inside Senkaku, a closed wedge. My feet are very difficult for my opponent to attack. We've got tremendous braking pressure, and so that forms, as it were, the height of the hierarchy. It has maximal safety, both of our feet in the inside position. It offers tremendous braking potential, one of the strongest of all the braking locks, the inside heel hook, which translates most of its braking potential into the vulnerable MCL joint and requires very little range of motion in order to get significant brakes. And it offers the benefit of a closed wedge, which is very difficult for my opponent to dislodge, to break apart and move away from. That is, as it were, the highest point in the leg lock system. Whenever my athletes come up against tough, physically demanding opponents and the lesser versions of the leg lock game are not working, I always encourage them to work towards inside heel hooks for maximal braking power, feet on the inside, cross ashigarami, and closed wedges. And so typically I always drive them towards the idea of some variation of inside Senkaku, cross ashigarami, inside heel hook. If you can get all of those together, you're going to put your opponents under severe pressure and submit a lot of people with the leg lock game. Now, there are other benefits which push this cross ashigarami to preferred status, as it were, in the leg lock system. Whenever we go to work with an opponent, regardless of the ashigarami we choose, we're always going to find that we have on the part of our opponent a primary and a secondary leg. The primary leg is always the leg which is bound up inside your ashigarami, regardless of the ashigarami that you use. Here, in the case of a cross ashigarami, my opponent's right leg is inside my ashigarami. That's the primary leg. The secondary leg is the one which is outside my ashigarami. Okay? If I work in a straight ashigarami situation, regardless of type, I'll demonstrate it from an outside ashi. Here, we have a straight ashigarami situation. I've chosen an outside ashi variation. Here, the primary leg is right there in front of me, but the secondary leg is behind me, difficult to access. As a result, I have to do 100% of my work on one leg. A very important principle in the leg lock game is the idea that almost all of your opponent's resistance to any given leg lock will come from the secondary leg. This is the principle of double trouble. If my opponent's secondary leg is not monitored, it can become a very strong part of his resistance. So for example, my opponent could pommel his leg over the top, and as I try to work for a heel hook here, he could roll across my body and start exposing me in various ways to his own counterattacks. Okay? All this changes when we get into a cross ashigarami position. In cross ashigarami, both primary and secondary leg are directly in front of me. That means at any given time I can almost always access both legs, and we can use this very, very profitably. If we understand that the majority of my opponent's defense in situations like this comes from the secondary leg, one of the things that's very much to our interest is to tie up that secondary leg as well. Now my legs are tying up the primary leg, but I still have two free hands to catch and control my opponent's secondary leg and tie it up. I have two great options. I can use what we call overwrap grips, where I take a 2-on-1, go through and lock up, rather like an Achilles lock, although here I have no interest in the Achilles, I'm just holding the leg, and I overwrap my opponent's ankle. Notice that we never refer to this as an overhook. When we talk about overhooks, that's a grip on my opponent's upper body. I don't want ambiguity in my terminology when I'm coaching people. So when I talk about an overhook, we use it in the same sense that wrestlers do, referring to a hook over my opponent's arms. If we're in a situation grappling here and I start calling for overhooks, I don't want my students to be ambiguous as to whether I mean this or this. Okay, every time I give a command, it should be unambiguous. So let's call this an overwrap. Okay, hold it in just like so. Now, the second option we have here are variations of scoop grips. I can also go underneath my opponent's leg and bring it up to the side of my neck and hold my opponent like so. This too is another fine example of the principle of double trouble. Once again, the secondary leg is completely controlled. When he goes to turn around, move, etc., it's so difficult. Whether you choose overwraps or scooping up to the neck, you're going to find you get tremendous control of your opponent in this position. Now, one of the great benefits of locking up both of your opponent's legs is it inhibits motion. Essentially, when we pin both of our opponent's legs in this fashion, whether it be with an overwrap or with a scoop up to the neck, essentially what you're doing is you're shackling your training partner's 2 feet together. If you want to prohibit a human being from moving, you can't do better than shackling their ankles together. That destroys whatever athletic potential they have, and that's exactly what we do here. As long as my opponent can move his legs independently, he has a lot of athletic potential. He can be a serious problem to me. But the moment I catch my opponent's ankles and shackle them together, whatever athleticism he has been robbed from him. He can go to twist, turn, move, stand up, etc. He's not going anywhere. This is as effective an immobilizing pin as any chest-to-chest upper body pin. I can hold someone in this position for minutes at a time, just as I could from, say, for example, mounted position or cross-side. I consider this pin to be fully the equivalent of, say, for example, mount or side control or north-south in terms of an ability to inhibit movement and stop my opponent from doing what he wants to do. Just like those upper body pins, this lower body pin can hold people for long periods of time and set up a process towards submission. So, we've seen that the cross Ashigurami system has a special ranking in the overall hierarchy of our leg system. It is, as it were, in the upper echelons, and in fact certain varieties of it are the highest point. Okay, we've seen that we measure it according to a certain kind of fashion. The first is the safety of my feet. If I have any generic form of Ashigurami, there's some degree of foot exposure to my opponent, and he can start going after my feet here. Okay, that's never a good thing. But the moment we put our feet to the inside, our feet are relatively safe. The actual braking mechanism used here, the inside heel hook, is in my opinion the strongest and fastest, the easiest to use out of all the various ways of breaking the human leg. At the same time, not only do we have tremendous safety on the part of our own feet, tremendous braking potential, but it works well in accordance with the principle of closed wedges, because from here a certain variation of inside foot position enables us to start locking up full senkakus on our training partner in many different directions. Doesn't matter whether my foot's outside, inside, semi, full, they're all immensely strong braking positions, and they are examples of reinforced wedges, so that when my opponent tries to move my legs and physically use his hands to push, he's not going anywhere. Those wedges are locked in place. One leg is reinforcing the other leg. In addition, this is one of the very few Ashiguramis that places both the primary and the secondary leg directly within my control. One is controlled with my legs, the other with my arms, either with overwraps or scoops. In either case, this is going to lead directly into many of the leg lock finishes that we'll be looking at shortly in this series on cross Ashigurami. We've seen that the leg lock system is really an amalgamation of three very separate and yet linked subsystems: the straight Ashigurami system, the cross Ashigurami system, and the reverse Ashigurami system. Let's look now at the cross Ashigurami system and start to understand some of the similarities and differences between it and other systems that we work with. If Placido is sitting in front of me and his leg goes across my center line, his right leg across my right hip, this will be obviously a cross Ashigurami situation. As a general rule, we like to work with our feet inside our training partner's legs. It is possible in situations like this to work with your feet on the outside, but now there's increasing vulnerability and on my part to my opponent's attacks, and a general lessening in control and an ability to switch off into other options that we want to avoid. So as a general rule, we much prefer to have our feet in the inside position, just like so. Now, you guys are familiar with some of the concepts we worked with regards to the straight Ashigurami system. Let's look at some obvious similarities between straight Ashigurami and cross Ashigurami. One thing that doesn't change is the notion of knee and knee line. Okay? Regardless of what kind of heel hook I'm going to attempt, one thing always remains unchanged. I have to keep my opponent's knee inside my knee line. We're defining the knee line as a straight line that joins my left and right knee, and Placido's knee must remain within that line. Okay, so a very important thing in situations like this is I'll be able to maintain that knee line relationship. One of our favorite ways to work in this situation is to control the secondary leg, like so. If I see Placido begin to move out of this position, I will take my arm and I will put an extra wedge underneath my training partner's primary leg and lock in just like so. Okay, when he tries to shuffle out now, that extra wedge means that at any given moment I can always bring his knee back inside my knee line and lock up more securely. So if you're in this situation, the cross Ashigurami, and you feel your opponent is doing a good job of slipping his knee and you feel distance is increasing between you, this is the time to take your arm, go elbow deep around your training partner's knee to put that extra wedge in. So when he tries to go further out, it's very, very difficult. And now I can use that extra wedge to draw him back inside my knee line and go back into work. So this obviously is a similarity with the previous Ashiguramis that we looked at in the straight Ashigurami system. Nonetheless, there are also some very important differences. One of the more noticeable differences when we get into a cross Ashigurami situation is that for the first time we now have two legs in front of us. In a straight Ashigurami situation, we always have, regardless of the Ashigurami, one leg in front of us, okay, and one leg behind us. All that changes in a cross Ashigurami situation, where now for the first time we have two legs in front. There's going to be many advantages to that. This is one reason why we strongly favor this position. We also find that the nature of the heel hook itself, the inside heel hook, is substantially different. In an inside heel hook, the primary stress on my training partner's body when I go into a heel hook is going to be on the MCL, as opposed to a straight Ashigurami system where the primary stress is on the LCL, on the outside of the leg. So we tend to get slightly more catastrophic breaks on our opponent's leg. So in heated situations where you need to maximize braking power, we generally have a preference for inside heel hooks out of a cross Ashigurami. So you see there's some similarities, some differences when we go to this position. We're looking at the cross Ashigurami system. Let's add in some preliminary thoughts that will be very, very important as we go through this video. We said earlier that when we work in any cross Ashigurami situation, we've got two legs in front of us. Let's make a very, very important distinction between a primary and a secondary leg. Let's define the primary leg as the leg which is actually held by my Ashigurami. That's the one that's caught between my two legs. Okay? We call it the primary leg because ultimately what we want to do is we want to get to the strongest heel hook in the entire sport of jiu-jitsu, okay, which is the inside heel hook. Ultimately, we're looking to get to this grip. Okay. However, we have to understand that around 90% of my opponent's escape potential comes from his secondary leg. That's what's going to enable him to pommel his foot inside my feet, and then from here go on to attack me with counters. That's what's going to enable him to start turning and spinning in this direction to get away from my Ashigurami. So most of his escape potential comes from the secondary leg, whereas most of my submission potential comes on the primary leg. Okay? So when we get into this position, the primary leg is the one we're going to be attacking. The secondary leg is the one we typically use to bind up, to get control over a difficult, unmanageable opponent. Okay? So let's always keep that in mind as we work. When we talk about a primary leg, that's the one that's held inside our Ashigurami, and the secondary leg is the other leg, which usually generates most of our opponent's escape potential. We're looking at the cross Ashigurami subsystem within the general leg lock system. I'm going to talk now about a very, very important distinction in how we go to operate in this position. There's a basic split in two methods that I can work out of any cross Ashigurami situation. I would like it very much to be being proficient at both. I do have a preference, but that doesn't mean that you should only specialize in one or the other. Okay, there are absolutely going to be times where you have to work with the other option, even if you have a preferred option. So it very much pays to be proficient in both. Let's have a look at the distinction. Whenever I work in a cross Ashigurami system, we've seen there's two legs in front of us. Okay, how I go to operate in this situation, it will come down to two fundamental choices. Will I work attacking both of my opponent's legs, or will I work with one leg? Okay, single leg versus double leg options, essentially. Okay, my preference is always to control both legs. Okay, I like the control that comes with this. I like the fact that I can slow the match down and limit my training partner's movements. But I would be a liar if I said to you, you're always going to be able to get two legs. Okay, you're going to have many opponents who do a good job of splitting their legs and starting moving away. And now I have to work with one leg, and I should still be able to be successful under those circumstances. We're going to coach this position as though there were a split between those two options. Okay, because how I go to operate is entirely dependent upon which of those two options is open to me. Okay, I'm going to coach first my preference, which is to work with the principle of double trouble and lock up both of my opponent's legs. Okay, then we're going to come back later to the idea of working with a single leg and still being able to get to a successful submission without the use of the second leg. But our first line of direction in investigating the cross Ashigurami position is going to be to work with two legs, the double leg scenario, okay, working with double trouble, where we bind up our training partner's legs, like so. Then later on, we'll come back to the single leg situation where the other leg, the secondary leg, is too far away from me, and now I have to go to work on one leg to get the submission. You guys know that a central tenet of my teaching philosophy in Jiu-Jitsu is what we call central problem theory. That for any given scenario or position in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, regardless of what it is, there's always at least one central problem that motivates both me as the person performing the action and my opponent as the person resisting the action. If you show me any given position or scenario in the sport of Jiu-Jitsu, I can always identify at least one central problem that will motivate the actions of the two athletes. Let's look at how this occurs in the case of cross Ashigurami. Whenever we're here, the fundamental problem that we face in this situation is what I refer to as the turnout problem. Let's see how the turnout problem materializes and how it drives the action in a given direction once the athletes get into this position. If my opponent were naive and he turned into me, that would be a terrible mistake on his part, because essentially what he's done is he's exposed his own heel to my inside heel hook. Here, Placido starts in a neutral position, but by turning into me, he's clearly exposed the heel without me having to do any work. Even if he high-legged over and stepped over, it would not help, because his high leg will never beat the power of a closed wedge inside Sankaku. I can return him to the mat, into the heel hook, or if he's so physically strong that he maintains his position, we'll just break him right here. Okay? Even his entire moving body weight won't break the strength of my Sankaku around his leg. So that would be a terrible mistake on his part. Another common mistake is people will move backwards in straight lines. Okay, you know what they're trying to do. It's not a bad idea on their part. They're trying to take their knee outside of my knee line, but I have a closed wedge around their legs. And when he moves back, it's so easy for me just to stay stuck to him. And as he moves back, he's doing nothing to hide his heel, and as a result, we can easily go in and get the break. Okay, so movements straight backwards are ineffective. Movements into me are worse than ineffective, actually positively hazardous. So what's the right thing for him to do? It's always to begin an action of turning out in this direction. Okay? Even if I had a heel hook coming back, Placido, he would fight my hands, split my hands, slip his heel, and then begin to turn out. Okay? Once Placido engages in the turnout, interesting things start to happen. Let's look at the first. Come back. From here, as long as my head is inside my training partner's legs, I can access the heel. The moment my head goes outside his legs, it's very, very difficult for me now to start accessing the heel. By turning in this direction, that's exactly what Placido is doing. He's putting my head outside of his legs. And as a result, it's getting harder and harder for me to access his heel. The only way I can try is to try and come down to an elbow, and that unweights my leg. Makes me very vulnerable to a simple thumb post, and now Placido can easily slip his legs out and not only escape, he can actually start countering me in this position. Now I can end up in my own cross ashigarami. I have to fight my way out of that. Okay? So this is always the problem associated with the turn-out escape. Okay? Whenever someone goes to turn away from me, it does a good job of first hiding their heel and then unweighting one of my major ashigarami legs, the outside leg, and from here, it's an easy knee slip. I've no longer controlled the knee line, and he's gone. The heel hook is lost. Okay? So the smart thing for him to do, whether I have the heel or not, is always to turn out in this direction. Okay? That simple insight will motivate both his actions and my actions in this position. Everything we do in the cross ashigarami position, and everything you will do as a student, will be motivated and given direction by this simple insight. The whole cross ashigarami system, which I teach, is essentially a response to this one central problem. We will soon see that the central problem, the turnout problem, creates spin-off problems, which we will have to confront as we go further into the system. But whether I choose to work with a single leg or whether I choose to work with a double leg is essentially a response to this problem. How I go to act will be an attempt to overcome this turnout problem. We're looking at the cross ashigarami system. Let's get further into it now. In a situation where I'm locked up with Placido in a cross ashigarami, we've seen there's a central problem that we're always trying to overcome, the turnout problem. Okay? My personal favorite response to the turnout problem always comes back to the principle of double trouble. I know in order to turn out his secondary leg, the knee must go away from me and point away. It has to happen. Okay? So my number one thing that I favor above all others is to go into a different form of ashigarami and seize my opponent's secondary leg. You will often see my students make use of this principle. All of them do it extremely well, and all of them have had tremendous success with it. Okay? The first issue that I face here is not the issue of breaking my opponent. It's of controlling his movement. His movement is designed to get him away, turning out in this direction, and I've got to do something to address that. I have to address this. Okay? I can't go fishing for a heel hook when the question of movement and control hasn't been resolved yet. Okay? This is not the time for heel hooking. This is the time for stopping movement. Okay? So, as soon as I get into this position like this and I see any kind of movement away, my number one thing is to straighten my leg, get a 2-on-1 grip, and snatch my opponent one above the knee and one below the knee. Now, let's be very careful how we grip here. Okay? Do not go in superficially with your fingers. I need to go wrist deep around my opponent's leg. That means both of my wrists have to bend at least 90 degrees. Okay? I'm looking not to grip the leg, I'm looking to grip the knee tendon underneath here. I want to take 4 fingers and lock in here. 4 fingers here. So, once again, as he goes to turn away, I reach and grip. Once I get my grip, I draw everything back and lock it up with an Achilles hold here. Now, I'm not trying to put any heat on his leg at this point. I'm not trying to hurt him with this look. I just hold him in place. Okay? Now, when he goes to turn in this direction, only the upper body can turn. I don't care about the upper body in this situation. I care about the lower body. His upper body can turn, yeah, absolutely. But the part that counts isn't turning anywhere. He won't be able to complete a turnout. I can hold someone here for long periods of time. We've seen, even if you lose the knee line in this situation, you can recover it here very, very easily by putting an extra wedge in and drawing him back. If I want my opponent to move in any given direction, I can do it. If I want him to fall this way, it's an easy thing for me to do. If I want my opponent to roll over in this direction, it's an easy thing for me to accomplish. I control someone here at this point. Okay? This is absolutely one of the most controlling positions that I know of in the sport of jiu-jitsu. I have the same amount of control over someone here as I would in, say, the mounted position or the rear mounted position. I completely control the direction and capacity for movement that my opponent has. You can see what's behind this. Essentially, what you've done is you've shackled your training partner's 2 ankles together. It's like, you know, if you want to control an unruly prisoner, what's a great thing to do is to handcuff his 2 ankles together. He's not going to run away at all. He's completely controlled. That's essentially what I've done here. Whatever athleticism my opponent has is destroyed by the fact that his 2 ankles are shackled together by this grip. Okay, so essentially my response, my favorite response, I should say, to the turnout problem is to make a switch to a new form of Ashigurami. I had the basic bare bones cross Ashigurami, and I went across and I took a lace leg or ankle lace Ashigurami, where I took a hold of my training partner's leg and laced his two ankles together. The moment I get to this position, I know I control my opponent's movement in a way which no other Ashigurami can do. We're looking at the cross Ashigurami position. We've seen that there's a fundamental problem here, a central problem, the turnout problem. We've seen my favorite response to that is to switch to a new form of Ashigurami, the ankle lace Ashigurami, which more or less prevents a turnout. Now, we know something here. Ultimately, we want to push ourselves to the top of the breaking hierarchy. And we know the top of the hierarchy for breaking and leg locking is this, the inside heel hook. As good as the ankle lace Ashigurami is for controlling people, there's an obvious problem here. If I hold on to the secondary leg, how am I going to heel hook the primary leg? At some point, I've got to release this leg. And that's when things start getting interesting. Now we get a new derivative problem. The central problem we faced was always the turnout problem. We solved that by switching to a new form of Ashigurami, the lace leg or ankle lace Ashigurami. At some point, if I want to heel hook this man, I have to release the secondary leg. The moment I go to release the secondary leg, the whole turnout problem emerges anew, and now there's a race to get to the heel. Okay? I often refer to this as the release problem. That when I go to release my opponent's leg, the turnout problem re-emerges. Okay? So here I've stopped the turnout. Now I want to get my heel hook. I release, and it's gone again. Okay? Learning to overcome the release problem is one of the keys to success to this position, and it's something you will have to become highly proficient at. We're going to look now in considerable detail at how we manage the release of the secondary leg and get through to a successful submission. Now, we've been looking at the idea of a cross Ashigurami position. We've seen there's a central problem, the turnout problem, and we've seen our first method of managing the turnout problem or overcoming it is to lock up, switch to a new form of Ashigurami and lock up our opponent's secondary leg and prevent him from turning out. But this creates a new problem, a follow-up problem as it were, the release problem. When I go to perform a heel hook, I have to release my opponent's secondary leg and then he can turn out again. So we're going to look now at managing the release of our opponent's secondary leg so we can get through to some successful breaks. The first recommendation I'm going to give you, the first method of overcoming the release problem is don't release the leg. Just don't. There's ways to attack your opponent's legs that don't require you to release it. Okay? Let's look at some of those right now. Once I get a hold of my training partner's leg in this position, one excellent way for me to operate is to perform a very strong version of the Achilles lock on my training partner's secondary leg at the ankle. Okay? So from here, I'm going to lift my training partner's secondary leg and I'm going to pass my arm inside and underneath my right arm. Do not put your free forearm in front. Rather, go through underneath and behind. As a result, my thumb is very, very close to my training partner's ankle, where it should be for any good Achilles lock. I don't want my thumb halfway down the shin where you're going to have a very poor breaking potential. I want to make sure that as my second or free hand comes in, it locks. It's right there underneath my training partner's ankle. That means that when I lock a reverse figure four grip on my training partner, we're right down where we can put extreme pressure on our training partner's anterior tibialis tendon on the front of the ankle. From here, I'm going to lock up on my training partner and point my elbow, in this case my right elbow, in towards his hips. Do not just go back in this direction and split the legs. I want to bring one leg down on top of the other, and as a result we can put tremendous braking pressure through this Achilles lock. It's very, very intimidating for my opponent. His only real recourse to this situation is to go forward and fight my hands. Okay? The moment I see someone engage in the hand fight, I just turn my wrists. He thinks, hey, I'm going to get my leg out. The secondary leg starts to pop out, and it leads me right into the second horn of the dilemma. It's such a short transition into the inside heel hook that you're almost guaranteed to get it. Okay? Let's have a look at that again. We start off cross ashigarami situation, we transfer it into an ankle lace ashigarami to prevent the turnout. Okay? From this situation, my opponent is, I feel if I go to release the secondary leg, he's going to quickly spin out and escape. So I'm going to go with a strategy of simply not releasing the leg. Okay? The key is that I feed my free hand inside and underneath so that when it emerges, it's below my training partner's ankle. Do not have your thumb above the ankle. The whole key is to come in here below, so that when I lock my my figure 4 grip, it's going to be operating right and putting tremendous tension on the anterior tibialis tendon, as opposed to just generic pain or discomfort on my opponent's foot. Now, from here, when I lock up, watch my right elbow. My right elbow does not go across the leg. It goes pointing in towards my training partner's hips, and my right shoulder goes down towards my opponent's primary foot. And as a result, you get truly intimidating tension on the leg. Your opponent will have to address this at the expense of his anterior tibialis tendon if he does it. As he goes forward to fight the hands, he has no capacity to turn out. So that as I lose one grip, I just let it go, and the distance I have to travel is so short that by the time he goes to turn out, there's just not time. And as a result, we get the break we always wanted all along. This is a classic example of the principle of dilemma in operation. I create a dilemma between my opponent's secondary ankle and the primary knee. Okay, so here we are, we lock up. My opponent's doing a good job of putting tension in this direction, so I know if I just release the leg, he's going to be gone. Okay, so from here I feed the hand in, making sure I go in below the ankle. When I lock up, we get a very, very strong submission. He has to address the submission. When I see him addressing it, he's got to go down to withdraw his foot. My ankle's so close, there's simply not time for my opponent to turn out. We're looking at the whole cross ashigarami position. We've seen the central problem, the problem of turnout. We've seen that when Placido is in this position, his number one method of working in this situation is always to turn away so that he prevents his heel from being exposed to my attacks. Okay? We've seen one great way of dealing with the turnout problem is to lace up my opponent's ankles in a ankle lace ashigarami that more or less prevents my opponent from turning out. This creates a new problem, the release problem, that if I want to get into a heel hook, at some point I've got to release Placido's leg. Okay, and the moment I do that, now he's free to turn out a second time. Okay, so I have to learn to manage the release of this second leg in some way. I have to have some kind of strategy for releasing this leg. And the first strategy we're looking at is just don't release it. Okay, attack the secondary leg in itself. We just saw a reverse figure 4 lock where I came through and locked like so. This is not the only method of locking this position. Another one, which is very, very useful, is a more standardized Achilles grip, but a very different way of placing my opponent's foot to maximize damage on the anterior tibialis tendon. As my opponent works in this position, I'm going to feed my hand through, just like so. Okay? So I have a free hand that goes through at my training partner's knee. My second hand saws down to my opponent's ankle. I don't want to be around here. I bring the elbow back in line with his ankle. As a result, I can shrug my hips back and at the same time thrust my elbow in front of me. This does something very, very interesting. It places my training partner's heel right here on my rib cage. I'm going to change my position so you can see this more clearly on the camera. Watch very clearly. The sole of Placido's heel will be placed on my floating rib. Here, I punch my hand through, I saw my hand in place, and then I place his heel right there on my floating rib. This does something very important. A standardized counter to most forms of Achilles locks involve pushing your foot through, often referred to as putting the boot on, where Placido will push his legs through and make it very difficult for me to apply any kind of braking force to my opponent's ankle. When I place the sole of my training partner's foot on my floating rib, it makes putting on the boot or pushing through extremely difficult. In addition, it creates some very interesting grip variations. The grip variation I'm going to demonstrate here is a variation on figure 4 grips. Here, I grab a hold of my own bicep and my own shoulder. Now, I point my elbow at my training partner's hips and it puts direct pressure on my training partner's anterior tibialis. Again, it's a very, very painful lock, which will actually do genuine damage to your opponent as opposed to merely cause pain. You actually are attacking an actual tendon in the leg rather than just a generalized pain to the back of the leg. So once again, my opponent's in here. We have his secondary leg well bound up. I bring my arm in. I punch my training partner's heel right there, the sole of the heel, onto my floating rib. So when he goes to push his leg through, it's exceptionally difficult. It just runs right into my torso. From here I grab the bicep, my own shoulder, and I drive through into the lock. Now, having seen that detail of the heel, we're going to relocate so you can see the follow-ons that come from this move. From here, same as before, we tie up our training partner's secondary leg. I want to stay on the leg so that my opponent can't simply turn out the moment I release it. We've seen that from here, by punching through on my training partner's leg, I can now come down to the ankle and then push the sole of his heel right onto my floating rib. Then we lock up a figure 4 grip. Ordinarily, I'm not a big fan of this grip for Achilles locks, but this particular variation, it works extremely well. From here, I push my elbow forward. My opponent has to fight my hands, just as before. And just as before we created a dilemma, so too we're going to create a dilemma here. As I lose the grip and he starts pulling his foot free, like so, fighting to save himself. That's exactly when we just fall straight back. We've got a short distance to cover, and as a result, we can successfully transfer into the inside heel hook. Once again, I start off, I lock in, and I get that heel into a perfect breaking position. You'll break a lot of people in this position here. It's a difficult thing to get away from. He has to fight my hands now. When I see him fighting the hands, look how I just pull on the outside of the heel, and even as he goes to turn up, we've got the catch, and we're in a winning position. We're looking at the cross Ashigurami position. We're looking at the response to the central problem that motivates and directs this entire position, the so-called turnout problem. From a situation where Placido is in a cross Ashigurami, we know the direction of his escape is always out and away. We've seen that a very good response to that is an ankle lace Ashigurami that prevents the turnout. Okay. Unfortunately, a new problem starts to emerge. At some point, I've got to release the secondary leg if I want to get a heel hook on the primary leg. And that gives him a second chance for my opponent to move away from me. Another way we can stop our opponent from getting out using the same strategy of not releasing the secondary leg involves a double heel hook. One of my favorite things to do here is to get a wrist deep grip around my training partner's calf muscle and start turning down on my opponent's calf so that I start to expose the heel of the secondary leg. Okay. From here, I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to punch through and lock what looks like a rather weak-looking heel hook on my opponent's secondary leg. Once I get that initial bite on the heel, I'm going to lift and we're going to go into a figure 4, reverse figure 4 grip with a heel hook on the secondary leg. That's interesting. I put my elbow inside the ankle of the primary, inside the primary ankle, and then I start applying a very strong outside heel hook on the secondary leg. Watch how I apply the heel hook pressure. It's a little different from normal. Watch my right elbow as I have the reverse figure 4. I point my right elbow at my training partner's hips. I'm not lifting across my body. Remember, I want my elbow to stay close to what I'm really thinking about all along, the ankle of the primary leg. So I push my ankle in, almost like I'm performing a figure 4 toe hold, but with a heel hook grip. This puts tremendous braking pressure on my training partner. The only way he can react to relief pressure is to turn in the direction of the heel hook, and that's a disaster. Because the moment he turns that way, he's exposed what I really wanted, the inside heel hook. Now I simply clear his foot out of my path. When he tries to go back to resist, it's done. If he tries to turn over, my inside Senkaku will always be stronger than his turnover. And we can just break in this position. Let's have a look at this double heel hook attack again. We get a hold of our training partner's secondary leg. From here, I use a turning action of my wrist to expose my training partner's heel. First, I put in a conventional heel hook grip. I lift and feed to a reverse figure 4 grip, much tighter. I put my elbow over Placido's primary foot. And from here, I put tremendous braking pressure on by pointing my elbow at his hips. It's going to force a defensive reaction. I lock a senkaku with my legs. I clear one heel hook and enter another. As a result, it's an easy thing for me now to make the switch into the strongest of all heel hooks, the top of the food chain, so to speak, of the leg locking game, the inside heel hook. We're looking at the cross ashigurami situation, and we're looking at one of the great problems associated with it, the turnout problem. We've seen our favorite response to the turnout problem is always to tie up our opponent's secondary leg into an ankle lace ashigurami. Once we get here, the question is always, how are you going to operate? Are you going to just stay on the leg and control him forever, or are you going to make a transition to actually break the guy? When you make the transition, at some point, you're going to have to release the secondary leg. Okay? And when that happens, now you got the release problem. One strategy to deal with the release problem is just don't release the leg. Attack the secondary leg itself. We've seen how to do that with various forms of Achilles locks and even heel hooks. Let's look now at a different way of operating a lace leg attack. From here, as I go to work on my training partner, I'm going to control my training partner's knee, and we're going to punch through on our training partner's leg. So that my arm, which is currently controlling the secondary ankle, punches between my training partner's ankles and goes elbow deep around our training partner's Achilles tendon. It is extremely important when you employ this move that your hand lines up with your opponent's toes. The further my hand from my opponent's toes, the more leverage I lose and power will bleed out of the technique. I want my hands up here at the end of the lever. Now, from this position, I don't take this hand and bring my right to my left. Again, I'm losing position. I want my left to come to my right, and we cross wrists and lock up. Now, my hands come to my heart. Everything goes across onto my center line, and this puts tremendous braking pressure through your opponent's legs. Okay? Done properly, he will feel this as an actual knee bar attack on his primary leg. If it's not done so well, it'll still feel immensely painful to your opponent, and is a truly intimidating lock. We will often use this to gauge the mental toughness of our training partners and opponents in competition. It's very, very difficult for my opponent to extract himself in. Both legs completely controlled. If he tries to turn out in this direction, it's just simply not going to happen. If he tries to spin over in this direction, that's not going to help at all. And from here, we can put tremendous braking pressure on our training partner. Once again, we start off with an ankle lace ashigurami. From there, we're going to go into a lace leg break. I go through, punching in and locking up, lining my hand up with my opponent's foot. I bring my free hand to the breaking hand, not the other way around. And from here, I bring my hands to my heart. I like to pitch over onto my side. From here, I push with both feet, and I pull one leg across the other for a punishing lock. Now, let's go further into the cross ashigurami situation. We've looked at one strategy for dealing with the release problem, which is don't release the leg, stay on it. Put pain and suffering into the secondary leg, and then as our opponent reacts to that, only then do we make a switch to the primary leg and the inside heel hook. Let's go to another strategy now, where we do start intentionally releasing the leg. But we're going to release that leg under our conditions, not under his. What does that mean? What does it say to mean I'm going to release it under my conditions? It means I'm going to release my opponent's secondary leg only when I have a hold on his heel. Remember, ultimately, this whole battle is a battle over heel exposure. I want to expose his heel, and obviously he wants the exact opposite. The whole reason why he turns out is to hide his heel from me. What I want is this, an exposed heel with my head inside his legs so I can go into the strongest lock in the sport, in the entire leg lock system. That's what I want, that's what he wants. Okay? Now, for me to have a control over the release of the secondary leg essentially means this. I have to have one arm at the wrist around his heel. If I have that, absolutely, I can release my opponent's secondary leg and be very confident of a successful break. So let's start looking now at how we can do this. From a situation where I have a hold of my opponent's secondary leg, I'm going to place what we call a splitter hand in between my training partner's two legs. I'm going to lift the secondary leg, and I'm going to place a forearm between my training partner's two legs. It functions as a splitter, splitting his two legs apart, as opposed to here where the legs are in contact with each other. So I lift and place the splitter hand in. The moment I get the splitter hand in, I'm going to take my free arm, and I'm going to go around the corner, I'm going to lock up right here. This creates an interesting situation. Push your foot in, ready? Push it in, good. This creates an interesting situation. I have my opponent's heel. If my opponent were naive, and he thought, hey, there's nothing holding my secondary leg in place, I'll take it out and go to turn out, he'll break himself because I already have the heel hook in place. Okay, let's have a look at that again. I'm in position, I lift and I insert the splitter hand. I go through and lock up. My opponent's been telling himself this whole time, if I turn out, I'm going to be safe. That's no longer true, because my hands are locked in the heel hook. If my opponent extracts his foot now and goes to turn out, I didn't have to do any work. His turning motion will break his leg. And when I add my force to it, I'll double that. This is where things get interesting. We now run into the third big problem associated with cross ashigurami. Once I get my opponent's heel locked in place like this, a new problem emerges. I often call this the interference problem, or the 2-foot problem. In order to break someone's leg in an inside heel hook, I must have 1 foot inside my armpit to get a satisfactory break. If there are 2 feet inside my armpit, 1 foot forms a kind of interference upon the other, and you never get truly satisfactory breaks. Yes, you can hurt people in this position. Yes, you can cause pain, but at World Championship level, people aren't going to tap to pain or discomfort. They're going to tap only because there's the threat of a severe break. And it's very, very hard for me to severely break someone's leg when there's 2 feet in my armpit. 1 foot characteristically interferes with the breaking of the other. So, if I have a knowledgeable, smart opponent, someone who knows the leg lock game pretty well, and I put a splitter hand in, and I come in here and lock, he's not going to turn out. He's going to realize that's suicide at this point. Instead, he's going to push his foot into my armpit to amplify the interference. Okay? How we deal with this, I'll show you right now. I'm going to pitch over onto my side. As Placido thrusts the foot in, watch my left knee. I'm going to place my left knee just inside his knee. So I repositioned it over his hip to the knee. Once my knee goes inside, I can use that as a pushing force. I pitch over onto my side and I push with my left knee into his left knee. And as a result, the secondary leg pops out like a champagne cork, but leaves the primary leg in place. And as a result, I can fall back now and go into a very, very strong break. Okay? Essentially what I'm doing is I'm using my legs to remove his secondary leg when I already have a heel hook in place. Okay? Don't make this common mistake. I see this all the time. People put a splitter hand in and they push too much, too strong, and both feet come out. That's a disaster, obviously. Okay? Don't make this mistake. I see people lock up and then just try to use their arm to move the guy's leg. You'll never move someone's leg with your arm. Okay? I have to use my legs to move him. I must pitch over to the side and then position my knee, and now I hold the heel hook tight and my left knee pushes his secondary leg out. When he goes to turn out now, no, I've already got the heel hook in place. My knees go against it and we get the break. Let's go further into the cross ashigurami system. We've seen that the big problem, the big picture that we're dealing with here is the turnout problem. My opponent at any given moment can start turning out and then hide his heel and eventually escape. Okay? We've seen one category of responses to this involves the use of 2 legs, double leg solutions, where we lock up the secondary leg and from here prevent turnouts. This takes us to a new problem. The problem of the release. How am I going to manage releasing the leg so I can get to an inside heel hook on the primary leg? Okay. We've seen that we can put in a splitter hand and split our training partner's legs apart in this situation. Okay. This creates a new problem in itself Now my opponent can run interference with the secondary leg by thrusting it into my armpit so that 2 feet go into my armpit and create unsatisfactory braking conditions. Okay? Whenever I see someone running interference with the secondary leg, one of our favorite strategies here is the elbow slicer. As I see my opponent pushing in, I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to grab a hold of my training partner's ankle, like so. From here, as my opponent puts that interfering leg and pushes it into my armpit, I know it's going to be very, very difficult for me to get a clean break. So I'm going to take my elbow and I'm going to position it right between my training partner's ankles. Do not just try to push with the strength of your elbow. If he makes 2 strong legs locked together, I will never use elbow strength to push through. Use your body weight. As he locks his ankles close together, I'm going to lean over my opponent's ankles, and body weight will enable me to slice my elbow between his 2 ankles. Now I simply arch back and split. Now, if we can just bring the camera to angle in on this, this is a very important detail. Currently, his heel is on the floor. I'm going to position my forearm on the floor next to his heel. I have my hand on the heel. In order to expose my opponent's heel, we're going to use the lifting method. Think of your forearm as being rather like a hurdle over which you must make your opponent's heel jump. I'm simply going to lift so that his shoelaces go into my armpit and his heel jumps over the top of my forearm. The moment we make that contact, my hands lock, my knees point back, and we're in perfect braking position. That's how we finish the elbow slicer. So, once again, we start off with good control over our opponent. I put in a splitter hand, just like so. My opponent recognizes the danger and starts pushing, running interference. His secondary leg is now interfering with the primary, and as a result, breaking him here is going to be very difficult. So from here, I'm going to seize the ankle. I'm going to bring my elbow as a slicer between his ankles, and I'm going to use body weight to punch and separate my training partner's 2 feet. Now, his heel is currently in a position where I cannot get my forearm around it. So I use a lifting method, and I take my opponent's heel over the hurdle of my forearm and lock it in place. The moment that occurs, my bottom knee faces my top knee, and we're in the perfect position to go in and get the break. Let's go further into the cross-arching Gurami system and look at some of the key elements of dealing with the problems that we're looking at. We've seen there's a central problem. The central problem is always the turnout problem. The overwhelming majority of my opponent's high percentage defenses to this situation involve turning out so that he hides his heel, and from here ultimately unweights my leg so he can start to free his knee from my knee line. Okay? We've seen that one of our favorite ways to stop this kind of process from happening, a solution to the turnout problem, is to switch to a new form of ashigurami, the ankle lace ashi, where I go through on my training partner and tie up the secondary leg. Now, the lower body cannot turn in that direction. Only his upper body can turn. Okay? We've seen, however, that this creates new problems. At some point, I want to perform an inside heel hook on the primary leg. That means at some point, I have to release the secondary leg. And now the whole turnout problem re-emerges. As I release the secondary, he is free now to turn out and start his escapes. We've seen also a new problem has started to emerge, that when we put splitter hands in and go to attack, my opponent can run interference with the secondary leg and put 2 feet in my armpit in a way that makes it very, very difficult for me to break my opponent's primary leg. Okay? So these are the 3 problems we deal with here. There's the grand problem, the one that starts it all, the turnout problem. There's an extrapolation of this, the release problem, and now there's the interference problem. There's one way that I can operate that overcomes all 3. This is the over-under method. From a situation where I start off like so, I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to put it here on my training partner's calf muscle. I'm going to bring my training partner's 2 knees together and close my knees, and I'm going to put my elbow down tight to his ankles. This creates an incredible locus of control around my opponent's legs and hips. Essentially what you've done here is you've created a 5-point wedge. You have 1, 2 knees around your opponent, pinching in and wedging on the outside of the legs. You have your hips as a wedge, a 3rd wedge, pushing up from underneath on your legs. You have a hand pulling down on top of your opponent's legs, and you have an elbow wedging down over both ankles. So when my training partner Placido tries to pull out of here, go. You are stuck to him like an anchor. Wherever he turns, you will stick to him, and the knee line will be preserved. It's an incredibly tight, controlling position. Okay? 5 points of wedging around your opponent's legs and hips. We can go the extra distance now. I'm going to move my head away, and I'm going to make my hand into the shape of a knife. I move over, and I spear the knife edge through my opponent's ankles and connect a 6th wedge, the shoelaces, to my neck. When my opponent goes to pull away from me now, you have a 6-point wedge. From here, it's almost impossible for your opponent to pull, roll, or move away. At the same time, you now have an exposed heel behind you. I can tilt my opponent over by planting a foot and using my cross-buttock position to take my opponent over and expose his heel. I lock an inside senkaku with my legs, create an even stronger wedging effect. And now I use a reach back to go in and secure my training partner's heel. There's no reason now why I can't go through the legs and lock. Wherever he goes now, it doesn't matter. The inside heel hook is locked, and we've got the finish in place. Let's have a look at this whole sequence again. From a situation where Placido is locked up in my cross ashigarami, we know the direction of his escape is out here. We tie up the secondary leg. Now, I bind his legs together, secure with my 2 knees, and create a 5-point wedge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We convert this to a 6-point wedge by spearing the hand through and locking the shoelaces to our neck. From the 6-point wedge, it's almost impossible for your opponent to pull away. Now, from here, we have an exposed heel to work with. I can tilt my opponent in any number of different directions. I can tilt him to my left and expose his heel. I can keep him where he is and expose the heel. I can roll face down and still expose the heel for the finish. The over-under method. Okay, let's look now at another method of controlling the situation out of cross ashigarami and getting through to a successful inside heel hook. We've seen from here, ultimately we want to release the secondary leg and get through to an inside heel hook, the strongest of all the heel hooks in this situation. Again, going back to the idea of a hierarchy. Out of all the various locks we can use, the inside heel hook is the top of the food chain. It's the best one, or the one we prefer. So we want to find ways to be able to control our opponent's leg, manage the release problem, and get through to a break. In the previous move, we looked at the over-under method. Let's look at a variation of that now, which I strongly favor, the double elbow method. From a situation where we start off laced in like so, we go to a 5-point wedge. We've seen once again, we have 1, 2, my hips, 3, my hand, 4, and my elbow, 5. 5 points of wedge around our opponent's legs and hips. So when he goes to move, it's extremely difficult. We can convert this into a 6-point wedge by making a knife hand, going through my opponent's ankles and locking it up and using my neck as a 6th wedge. Okay? When he tries to tear out of this position, it's awfully difficult. Okay? Now, one potential problem with this situation is my opponent can start taking his foot and moving it in this direction so that it takes a long time for me now to access the heel hook. When we see this, I point one elbow at Placido, and then I take my second elbow through underneath, and I physically hold his heel and pull his shoelaces to my armpit. So now both my elbows point at him. When he tries to move from here, it's shockingly difficult. And now, because his shoelaces are in my armpit, the transition to the inside heel hook is incredibly quick, and we get very strong breaks as a result. Once again, from an ankle lace ashigarami, I go through and we take a 5-point wedge. From the 5-point wedge, we convert to a 6-point wedge. When he tries to hide his foot from me, one elbow is pointing at him, I take the second hand through and connect. So both my elbows point at him, double elbow. From the double elbow position, it's such a quick transition, straight into the inside heel hook and a maximal break. Let's go further into the cross ashigarami system and look at the double cross method of dealing with the release problem. Here we have Placido in the cross ashigarami situation. We know the general course of his escape is away, turning out, and we know that one great solution to this is to lock up the secondary leg. Okay. In the previous moves, we saw the idea of creating what we call a 5-point wedge, where I lock in, wedging with 2 knees, hips, hand, elbow. From there, we form a knife hand, we go through, and we convert to a 6-point wedge, which is extremely difficult for my opponent to pull away from. Okay? Everything we did so far involved coming back directly to the heel. Another option is to take my opponent's secondary leg and make that cross my center line, so that both of my opponent's legs cross my center line in opposite directions. The way we do this is we move our head backwards. As the head goes backwards, I physically pull my opponent's leg across and I take a V grip on my training partner's Achilles tendon. As a result, I can quickly push across the body and wedge over both of my training partner's ankles. As he goes to pull away from me from here, both ankles are well wedged in place. I don't care whether you just go down with the arm or physically lock an Achilles lock. They're both good options. Okay? Once we get this grip, when my opponent tries to turn his foot out in this direction, it's so difficult for him to prevent me using a reach back. I take my thumb and I go back and I touch my own back. Here's a common problem. Sometimes I coach athletes who say they have a difficult time securing the heel in this position. It's usually because their head and body are leaning too far back, and as a result, they cannot get to the heel. Whenever you see this problem, simply sit up and forward by employing a forward shift so that my head goes to the same height as your training partner's head. As a result, I can always reach back and secure my training partner's heel. If I have to, I will use the strength of both legs to draw him back so his knee line goes back and I have the heel in place. Then from here, we go over the top, release, and finish. An interesting corollary to this position, where both legs go across, is that if you should lose your opponent's knee line in the course of the action and ultimately lose the leg and the leg comes out, don't worry. You're in the perfect position to renew your attacks. Simply by throwing your legs over the top, you can go right back in on the other side. Anytime I take my opponent's arms through in this situation and bring the leg across my body, anytime I lose my opponent's primary leg, his secondary leg will simply become your new primary leg, and you can make effortless switches from one leg to the other. Okay? Let's quickly review the move as a whole. We start off as we did the others. We get a hold of our training partner's leg like so. From here, we go immediately to a 5-point wedge. Then we convert it to a 6-point. From the 6-point wedge, we move the head back, pass the foot across the center line, and V-grip it to hold it in place. We put a wedge on top, and we sit up and forward to access the heel. And from here, we get a tremendously strong break. We're looking at the cross ashigarami position and the method of breaking from there, the inside heel hook. So far, everything that we've looked at has involved the use of both of our opponent's legs. We're appealing to the principle of double trouble. This is my personal favorite way of operating anytime we're in cross ashigarami. It's incredibly controlling and essentially converts your ashigarami into a method of pinning your opponent's movement. As I said earlier, you'll see all of my students using this repeatedly in top international competition, and they are able to hold some of the biggest, strongest, and most talented opponents for long periods of time and work their way methodically for the break. It's an incredibly effective way of controlling people's movement out of ashigarami. However, there are always going to be times where you cannot access the secondary leg, and you're going to have to go directly on the attack with one leg only under your control. This substantially changes the way we operate in this position, because it means now I don't really have a method of stopping my opponent from turning out. So instead of stopping the turning out, I have to learn to control the turnout. Essentially, when I say control the turnout, it means controlling the speed or the pace of the turnout. Let's have a look at what I mean by this. We've seen that the central problem in any cross ashigarami is the turnout problem. I would love to have heel exposure and get an inside heel hook on my opponent. He knows that. So of course he starts to turn. When he starts to turn, he positions my head in the one place that will make me ineffective in this position. My head is now outside his legs. To be effective in this position, I need my head inside my opponent's legs. Only then can I easily access the heel. The happiest times are when your opponent turns into you, because then he actually physically puts your head inside the legs and gives you the heel. Okay? But smart opponents know that, and so they're always turning away from you. If I had the secondary leg, then we could use all the methods that we saw previously to go in and successfully complete the attack. But if I don't have the leg, what do I do now? Well, essentially what I have to do is I have to get my head back inside the legs, and I have to slow down the pace of my opponent's turn so that ultimately my turn is faster than his. I have to play catch up so that I can get to the heel. The problem is, most of the time, he goes first. He's the escaping guy, he bolts off, and you have to play catch up. A very, very important concept whenever we work in this position is very simple to state. Essentially what's going on here is a race. It's a race for my head position inside his legs. If I can win that race, I can access the heel. Let's understand something. There's two ways to win a race of any kind. I can make myself faster, or I can make the other guy slower. Usain Bolt is the fastest man in the world. I'm a 51-year-old cripple with a hip replacement. If we get into a 100-meter race, of course I'm going to lose very, very badly. But if you let me shackle Usain Bolt's legs together and tie his hands behind his back, even I can win in a race of that nature. It's not because I got faster, it's because I made the other guy slower. Most of jiu-jitsu is built along those lines. It's about making your opponent slower rather than yourself faster. How does this work in this case? How do I make Placido slower so that I can control the pace of the roll? Let's look at that right now. Whenever I'm in this position and I see my opponent's getting away, the first thing I like to do is put on a hand brake, where I put my left hand around my opponent's knee and I physically hold the knee tendons. Don't just put your hand here superficially. That's not going to slow anybody down. I put my fingers all the way through and I bend my wrist 90 degrees so that it functions as a handbrake. I close my elbow, so when Placido goes to turn, it won't stop him, but it will slow him down. The next thing I do is I take my elbow and I put it here in the inside position. Okay? So I have a handbrake and an elbow brake. Now, the next part is, in my opinion, the most important. This is a head post. As we move over, I'm going to put my head on the floor. This creates a barrier for my opponent to roll over and slows everything down dramatically. The fourth ingredient is my left foot. It hooks here inside my training partner's left knee. When he tries to pull his body around to continue his turn, the combination of my head, my leg, my hand, and my elbow dramatically slows him down, so that when I start turning, I get to the heel every time, because my turn was faster than his. Not because I'm fast, but because I slowed him down. Let's have a look at that again. Essentially here, we have a race. The race is for him to move in this direction and put my head outside of his legs, knowing that if he can succeed in doing so, I'll never access his heel. Okay? So what I need to do is slow things down. So I take my hand and I go in here and lock. Okay? I put my elbow in place. Then as we go into the turn, I put my head on the floor, and my second foot locks in here at the knee. When he goes to complete the turn, it slows him down dramatically. It means that I can get my head inside and access the heel, so that as we emerge on the outside of the roll, I have the heel in place and a potential break. Essentially what we're doing here is we're identifying the problem in the single leg situation as a shared spiral, just as it was with the outside heel hook. We share the same spiral, we're spiraling in the same direction, and I have to control the speed of the spiral. In other words, my spiral has to go faster than his. I don't rely on my speed to get it done. I rely on my ability to slow him down. Let's have a look one more time at this important sequence. Once we get into a situation like this and I don't have my opponent's secondary leg, the first thing I'll do is that. I'll put in a handbrake. The second thing I'll do is this. So even as he begins to turn, it's not as fast as he wanted it to be. Then I put my head down on the floor and my leg goes across. So that even as we emerge out the other side, the heel hook is on. Now from here, my hands connect and we get to a successful break. This is my favorite way to deal with the cross ashigarami in situations where we have only one leg under our control. Essentially, I put a series of basic, simple mechanical breaks on my opponent. My hand, my elbow position, my head post on the floor, and my interfering foot in his leg. This slows my opponent down sufficiently that I can win the race for head position, get my head inside my opponent's legs, and therefore access the heel. So that as we share the spiral and roll through, I come out at the end of the spiral ahead of my opponent with a fully locked in inside heel hook.